Hello, and welcome to Pollinator Partnership's Monarch Habitat Management and Technical Training webinar series. This series is an extension of the Monarch Wings Across Eastern Broadleaf Forest program and is made possible with the support of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and in partnership with multiple agencies and organizations. I'm Elizabeth Kaufman, and I'm very happy to welcome Mike Retterer, whose presentations will cover project implementation and management. Mike is a graduate from the University of the Rio Grande, where he earned his Bachelor of Science degree focusing on wildlife conservation and management. He currently serves as the coordinating wildlife biologist for Pheasants Forever and serves as the state coordinator for the Ohio Pollinator Habitat Initiative, or OPHI, and for Pollinator Partnerships Project Wingspan. Mike works with private landowners and multiple state and federal agencies to provide technical assistance regarding the implementation of specific conservation measures and programs to improve native pollinator and wildlife habitat. Mike also works with a large group of diverse partners to help coordinate and influence habitat management efforts and participates in statewide meetings to further the mission of Pheasants Forever, OPHI, and statewide conservation efforts. Thanks so much for joining us today, Mike.
Thank you for having me. So we're going to cover some information today about implementation and management of pollinator sites and habitat in general. One of the first steps and one of the most important steps is the planning process. We need to make sure that before we can begin any work or implement anything, we need to understand what's going to be needed as far as equipment and personnel, and then also compare that to resources that we have both in-house and available to me through partners and or contractors. Another thing to consider is when working with pollinator habitats, with our really high diverse mixes, our bare open ground components that we look for, sometimes these plantings can take a little bit longer or need a little extra work just to make sure through that process and the establishment to keep those areas open and reduce competition. So the different types of planting methods that we'll discuss today is first the no-till drill planting method, which is typically the most common used method in native warm season grass plantings and pollinator sites. It's a very good site when going, or planting method when going into sites like crop fields. Also, this works really well if you have a sod field that you have prepared properly to go into. And then also understanding that it's still important to control all those weed pressures and have these sites properly prepared. But they definitely, using this method is very good in those situations. Planting with no-till drills, we definitely want to make sure that the site is adequately prepared, but then also the conditions of the day of the planting are beneficial to that. We want to make sure that the sites are not too muddy, that can cause issues with the drill, but we also want to make sure that the site isn't extremely dry in a drought type of situation, because even though we're planting these seeds into the ground and having good seed to soil contact, we want to make those conditions are adequate for the plants to germinate. One benefit of the no-till drill planting is that you can sort by the size of the seed. There's multiple boxes that will help with the placement of the seeds on the sites, but also to allow you to have a really precise planting method and also be able to use cover crop seeds for quick establishment periods, meeting certain standards like percent cover, and then also on sites that have potential for erosion. And then looking at the actual no-till drill planter itself, the reason they're beneficial and they're very common, being a no-till, a lot of times that means that there is a little bit of residue on the surface, or there can be. Those coulters there in the front, if you look at the picture, come in very handy. They essentially are almost like a disc type thing. They cut a slit into the ground and then also fold the opening to allow the disc openers to go down about a quarter or half inch into the ground. And the seed is placed between those disc openers, which are in a V pattern. The seed is delivered through the tubes and then drops down into then gets pressed into the ground via the press wheel for that good seed to soil contact. And again, understand that this planting method is generally placing these seeds about 1/4 to 1/2 inch at the most into the ground. Broadcast planting methods are also very beneficial, and we see excellent results. This can be done through frost seeding over the winter, as the picture with the snow gives you a good idea of where your broadcast is, how far your seeds are flowing, and your coverage. Can be done into prepared ground, as long as you get an adequate, about at least 50% bare soil, so that you're getting seeds onto the ground where they need to be planted. And then it can also be used on sites that have been prepared by disking and tillage, along with proper weed removal or unwanted vegetation removal prior. If you're going to be using these broadcasting methods on a prepared site, either via hand or via equipment, you're going to want to make sure that you do use call to packing to press that seed down into that fluffy soil for that good seed to soil contact, like what the press wheels would have done on the no-till drill. If you're frost seeding over the winter, there really is no need to call to pack or to press the seed down. Mother Nature, through the freezing and thawing, the snowfall, and the melting method, will actually take and place the seed into the ground for you. Another method to consider is using plugs, and these can be very beneficial, especially into small sites, sites you're using more as an educational garden where you're putting plants in a specific area, so for demonstration purposes. Rain gardens is another excellent choice for using plugs into. You can put them exactly where they want to be, with the wet species in the low areas, and then work your way up the slopes for the other species, as well as doing enhancements on either existing or just recently planted areas, to put out some of those species that may be very cost prohibited to include in seed mixes because they're very limited or are very costly to put out there. You can use a plug to plant those little communities out there as needed once you get the site started. With that, there are just a couple things that you want to consider. 18 to 24 inches apart. Generally would only probably be used if you were doing a garden type situation, more as a demonstration. We typically use that 18 to 24 inches as a guidance on once we're trying to figure out the quantity that we would put in a general area. Most of the time we're planting plugs in a group. Minimum of 5 to 6, these little communities within themselves. It's beneficial for the plants as well as the insects that utilize them. But one key point to look at is you still want to keep the top of the plug when you're planting it into the ground. You want to keep it out of the ground about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch, 1/2 inch at the most, just like you do when you're doing seedling plantings. You don't want to get them too deep, or else it can have adverse effects. You also want to make sure that your beds are not saturated, but properly watered, to maintain those plugs once you're planting them, and that conditions are good. And then also understand whenever you plant plugs that the majority of the time these plants will die back, because just like perennials, they got to work on their roots first. Once those get well established and rooted in again, they will regrow. Management and maintenance. So when we're thinking about this, we just got to understand is, what are we maintaining? At what stage of life or growth do we want to look at? So understanding that a lot of times, wherever we put something out, natural succession would like to happen. And typically we're trying to, as managers, manage that early successional kind of area. You know, we're going from our prepared field, but we want to keep it from either going to a woody situation or to a very dominated monoculture type state. So whichever way we're looking at it, we're trying to maintain it in a constant state of that early succession where we have the greatest diversity of plants, the greatest diversity of use from our different insects and animals that may inhabit those areas. Whichever we're doing, whether we're looking at this as maintenance or long-term management, we have to look at our goals. We understand that we want to control our natural succession. So what does that entail? Again, reduce aggressive species so it doesn't go to monoculture, any potential invading trees and shrubs, and or unwanted invasive species that are out there in the landscape. Are we maintaining that bare ground for reseeding purpose from annuals? Are we also keeping that bare ground for our native bees and other pollinators, as well as the ease for animals to be able to move through the site? And then also to keep that thatch reduction down over time so that we constantly have that reseeding or that bare ground so that a lot of our plants that spread through rhizomes can also get up there. And then how do we maintain that diversity throughout the process? You know, a lot of times by doing that, we'll have those happen naturally, but there are some times where we may need to do an interseeding, or just like mentioned before with the plugs, we may have a lack of something in a landscape and we want to go out there and plug in a specific host species or a specific beneficial plant or plants of a group that we need out there that we're lacking. And then understanding what are the benefits of what we're doing, because there are a lot of benefits out there, and it depends on your goals and what your end result is on what those benefits will actually be. Understanding that, you know, we use pollinator habitat, you know, kind of as a I guess, looking at it more as a, oh goodness, I'm struggling. As a benchmark, because we know that great pollinator habitat is great wildlife habitat. A lot of those same species are going to use that, but also understanding that one of the benefits is if it's great pollinator habitat, it looks nice, it's useful, you see it being used. Aesthetically, it's pleasing for a lot of folks. It's going to be sustainable. It's going to stay there and last a long time. So understanding is those flowering plants that are going to be out there are great for our insects, but they're also great for our young birds, because that's what our insects are their food source. It's going to create nesting and brooding habitat out there. And then also it's going to be utilized by deer and other mammals as food sources. And then maintenance. We have to understand that there are definitely multiple things that go into maintenance. Before we can perform any maintenance, we have to monitor or look at the site to see what conditions it's in, what's out there, so that then we can put together a management practice to either keep it at its existing state or alter it to whatever we're trying to get to. We also have to then understand is what is the best timing to perform that practice, because when we do things, can have as big or bigger effect on things as what we actually do. Doing things at the wrong time can have adverse effects, and we can actually hurt our stands by simply doing something at the wrong time. So we really want to make sure that we match the practices that we're coming up with, both management and timing, for our outcome or goals that we set for. What are we managing for? So when we're looking at monitoring, it's great that we go out there and look at everything, but we really want to make sure that we're not only counting the good things that are out there, but also looking at what may potentially be problems out there. So they're not always going to show themselves and, you know, hey, look at me. We may have to look for them, but also monitoring the sites, because adjacent to your site, you may have potential threats that you're going to want to keep an eye on. So again, good ID of both good and bad plants is important. And then it's also, for monitoring it, you want to be able to document that, you know, you're getting the best bang for your buck, or you're getting your desired effects out there, that it was worth the expense that you put into it as well as the time. And then there's several different management practices to choose from, and this is not all of them. These are just a kind of a list of them. You have mowing, you have herbicide, you have prescribed fires. All in themselves are very good. You can use them individually, or at times you may have to use combinations. And we also understand that not all of these practices can be done in all situations, but they definitely have their benefits on what they do. And depending on your goal, what you're kind of going to achieve, remember, you want to match the practice that you're doing to your goal and your outcome. And then there's also interseeding, and then there's soil disturbance, you know, and then also understand that any of these practices outside of the seeding is essentially a soil disturbance, but if you run a drill across of it, you are. So just remember, whenever you do a disturbance, you have a potential for those annual weeds to kind of come back in. Anytime you disturb that soil, move it over, turn it, you have the potential. So you want to just make sure you definitely monitor it after these disturbances. And then management practices in whole. Remember, every site is not different. What worked on one site may not work on a different site. And then, like we mentioned, more than likely, it's going to be a combination of those practices that are going to get you your end results out there. And then also consider, if you have large sites, that you may want to look at doing it on a rotation, a third or a half, not doing everything all at once. It's going to maximize your time, your equipment, your manpower, dollars, the whole 9 yards. Plus, then you can potentially have your habitat at stages of succession to benefit all species throughout their life cycles on the basically just in the one area there. And then we mentioned timing. Timing so varies based off of what you're trying to control or what you're trying to get established. Make sure we look at that. What I'll do for woodies may be different than what I'm doing for herbaceous periods. For those the herbaceous species, on those herbaceous species, when I'm looking at if I'm trying to target thistle, or if I'm going after a Johnson grass or Phragmites, they're going to have very different timing. Even though the practices may be the same, or what I'm trying to get out of it, I may have to just do different timing. And matching the timing to where I'm going to get the biggest effect and the best result is very important. But it's also important to take into considerations of what we're trying to manage for. Be out there doing things that may harm things during the primary nested season if that's what we're trying to have out there. And it doesn't do us any good to create all this habitat if we remove it while the monarchs are out there trying to reproduce or during one of their migration cycles. And then also, we don't want to do things that we would remove all this winter cover or potential food that a lot of these species would potentially need to go through from one cycle to another. So definitely match those practices to your problems. The biggest thing I hear a lot is, I don't want to do this because I have the potential to harm this or this and that. My thought process is if you don't remove what's unwanted, if you don't remove something that's invasive or aggressive, you're not going to have a stand anyways. Address the problem, go after it. Remember that a lot of these species, these native plants, these other species we're using have robust root systems. They're very, very, very hardy. So whereas you may lose something for a short term, a season, a few months, a year, you're very rarely going to remove them completely out of the cycle. And then again, it's very easy to intercede a small amount of something to bring it back if you do. But if you don't address the problem, you won't have any habitat or anything out there because it'll completely take over, and then it'll be less likely to be maintained. So when we're looking at our maintenance itself, this is spring seeding into crop residue. We can definitely see some of our unwanted species out there, but also we're looking there that we've also got some beneficial plants coming up. Make sure that we address what's out there. So that would be a very easy one to clip and mow the heads off of those plants to keep them from seeding out and not to hurt our good ones. And then a herbicide application on the spring seeding. You can definitely see your beneficial species out here. And at the same time, you can see that the rosettes of the unwanted species has been affected. So we want to monitor and make sure that we get the desired effect. If not, we can retreat at a later date. And then understand that we need to go after our targeted species. We just talked about that. Glyphosate is not a silver bullet for all weeds. We always don't get the end results that we're looking for, even though it does look like we get a complete total kill. You have to understand that once we remove that vegetation, that things can come back. There's seed bank there, there's root systems. We need to make sure our timing is right. We're definitely usually looking at multiple seasons. But we can still target those areas, knock them back, not hurt the beneficial ones, and then in the end, get a very, very successful stand to get started from. So there's various herbicides out there. Again, match the chemical to the plants. There are plateau tolerant or Amanzapic tolerant. There are milestone tolerant mixes. There are plants that can be resistant to a lot of chemicals depending on when we do them. So work with those professionals out there to put together, if you have a problem that you know you're going to have, design a mix that you're going to be able to address those issues with. So just wanted to wrap up with giving you some example sites, some things that have been planted and the process that it took them to get there. So this is about an 8-year-old pollinator planting. It was a previous construction site. It was spring seeded, so it was seeded with a no-till drill. And it's had spot mowing and herbicide applications throughout the 8 years to control unwanted. You can tell that there's woodies in the background that will definitely be coming in. So you're looking at controlling those, you know, in the fall, maybe once a year, once every third year, depending on the process or what species are coming in. This site did have a prescribed burn through the process once some of that thatch built up. There was an area, or isn't an area that we could do that, so it was burnt off. It was burnt off in the late summer, early fall, to where we removed the residue from the grasses and the plants, but we didn't increase our grass density, but yet we released our forbs. And that's the result. Here's another example site of a good pollinator project. This one's only about 4 years old. It had 2 to 3 herbicide applications, which is definitely recommended, multiple seasons to control all the unwanted species. You can see that there's still a few out there, but they're definitely in an enough rate that we can control them with just using spot sprays or spot mowing. And at the same time, remember everything in moderation. So even a small amount of some species is okay, whereas, you know, even some of our beneficial, we don't want monoculture. So if we have a few unwanted species, as long as we control them, maintain them, and keep our eye on them, you know, some of our aggressive goldenrods, we can tolerate them in small amounts. Now, this is kind of going down the path of some of the problems that we get out there in. This is a CRP planting. There's lots of common teasel out there. Had minimal site prep, which is a very common problem. That's usually the #1 reason why most of these sites fail, is due to the inadequate or lack of site prep. But at the same time, as you see out there, you know, it's going to need a very aggressive approach to get it back in there. We also have some bramble type species coming in there, some early successional. So this is going to really need a lot of work to get it back. But again, we can fix it. It's just going to take time. It's going to take resources to get it there. But there is a plan that can bring that back to a good site to look like one of the previous 2. And then here's another very common plot. It would have been something that would potentially been re-enrolled or established, and then the land manager or the landowner just walked away from it. There was no maintenance. They didn't keep up with the mowing during the first couple seasons. They didn't keep up with spot treatment. And basically now it's dominated by goldenrod. You can see some native grasses in there, but a lot of woody vegetation coming in. So just like the previous site, this would need a very aggressive approach to it. Really almost on the verge of completely starting over. But the good news is we could use species or use specific herbicides to target our unwanted broadleaves, not hurt our warm season grasses, and then therefore we would just be reseeding in forbs and legumes into this site. So there could be a plan that could bring that back. So just a general overview of timelines when a lot of this kind of takes place. So we've talked about a lot, management, planting. What would be a normal course of action for a lot of these sites? So make sure that before we get into this, and understanding is, to recap, you want to have some good plant ID skills, both for the beneficial and the unwanted species. Weed control is going to be crucial. We can't stress it enough, not only with site prep, but during those first few years of establishments and even up into the mid part. If you have aggressive sites, less maintenance will be required over time, but that's going to depend on your due diligence with the site prep and in the first couple years of establishment. And then understanding what plants you put out there and what their life cycles are is really going to help you match that timing of your practices to get your end goals. So typically on a year 1 planting, you know, once it's been put in the ground, we're going to make sure that we're looking for any emerging weeds or tree issues out there. We definitely want to make sure that those weeds don't get too tall. We want to keep them short. We don't want them to shade out or to cause problems with some of our germinating species. If you let them get too tall, they can do that, as well as then when you mow them, you're going to put a lot of thatch on the ground that can actually choke a lot of those species out. So also, again, cut them taller. You'll make sure that we don't have any issues. You don't want them You don't want to cut everything, and you just want to cut the weed heads off of those unwanted species without them getting too tall. And then in general, most times you're going to do a second mowing. If your first one's in June or July, if you're up here in the Midwest, if you're in the South, you know, it's going to be based off of your growing seasons. Then you're going to do a second mowing once a chance. So once they've been clipped or spot sprayed or however you've done your management in first year, a lot of those will try to regrow prior to shutdown. So you want to make sure that you keep an eye on those and don't let them get too tall for the second time. Then in your second year, a lot of those annual weeds will be gone, or they'll definitely be greatly reduced. So more than likely, you'll still have a mowing to do. Again, you want to mow those areas, you know, higher than 10 to 12 inches. You don't want to stress your young plants or your plants that have just germed in your second year. At the same time, not allowing any of those annual or even the perennial weeds to head out to reduce that number so that you're just dealing with plants and not more seed bank. And you can use spot treatments if needed. If you have some definitely targeted areas, maybe a couple little aggressive species have stayed in some small areas, you can go after those and address them, and definitely want to keep monitoring it throughout that year. They don't have any issues. And then 3 and 4, it's not on autopilot. You're mainly just monitoring, very limited spot spraying, spot mowing. And then essentially from here on out, it's kind of rinse and repeat. You're just going to keep an eye on it, mow and spot mow as needed to keep those unwanted species out of the sites. I wanted to say thank you to Pollinator Partnership for letting me be a part of this webinar series. I appreciate it. I enjoyed giving this information. Hopefully it was beneficial, and hopefully I will be on another webinar shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for your interest. For additional information and to access downloadable materials regarding monarch habitat creation, including ecoregional planting guides, habitat manuals, and additional webinars, please visit us at pollinator.org, where you can find these materials housed under the Resources tab. Additionally, as Mike said, monitoring is critical to understanding the successes and shortcomings of our efforts. So I'd like to encourage you to share information regarding opportunities for citizen scientists to participate in monitoring programs, such as Monarch Joint Venture's Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, and to use the new Insight app, which was created to empower citizens to participate in observation-based research. Thank you again.